Hey everyone. Today it's back to depth shots. Apparently, throwing crap at the wall to see how much of it sticks was not really the best way to go about it. It may have been okay for regular shots, maybe, but depth shots turned out to be much more nuanced than that. From one of the earliest videos, you may remember the approach to learning things that I have declared for myself. Step 1 was to always figure out what exactly this is. And this was more or less covered in diary number 45. But I do admit that that one was far from helpful on its own. The next step, step 2, is to figure out exactly how it works. And that's where we are today. I recently sat down for a few, well, actually more than a few hours, with an intention to really understand the mechanics of depth shots, to come up with a number of test cases and scenarios to isolate the influence of each and every one of the main algo parameters, and then to gradually start putting them all together and see how they work in concert. And the ultimate test of my own understanding, for me, was to be able to control the whole thing, to change the parameters in such a way where the algo does exactly what I expect it to do. And I think I've got it. Today I will try my best to recreate this process in a more condensed format without long stretches of time of me saying, "Wait, what? I don't get it, start over." So here goes nothing. I hope you enjoy. Here we are. Let's try some depth shots. We'll do an algorithm from scratch. Here, depth shots group. I'll give it a name. Now, I want the order to stay there without any interruptions. So all of the time windows, all of the latencies, all of the filters, I'm taking them all away. So if an order is canceled, I know that it's exactly canceled because of something that happened in the depth shots algorithm specifically. So here I'm going to go whatever, 5, restart delay 5. Let's set everything to 5, whatever. This market, then the coin will select in just a little bit, remove all of these guys, and now we're here. So let's start with the very default parameters. I'm gonna change nothing except for take profit and stop loss. Let's go depth, let's go 33, and stop loss, well, it doesn't really matter. 1.5 doesn't matter for the purposes of this demonstration here. Of course it matters in the end. Here we are. This is a very bare bones algorithm with no filters whatsoever, with all the default settings, and now we have to find a good coin for that. Well, it's not gonna be a very good coin, it's gonna be a suitable coin for the purposes of this demonstration. Let's go to Market Live and I'll show you what I mean. Here we go. So actually, I'm looking for the most boring coin. The coin that does not move and where the order book is pretty much stable. For that, I'm just gonna go whatever, sort by any type of delta, and there's absolutely no surprise to anybody who's ever opened a terminal, it's USDC. Here we are. You see the price is always pretty much the same, no movement whatsoever, and that's the way we like it. And also, look at the order book. It's pretty much unchanging, it's static. So this way, I'm going to be able to see exactly what my algorithm is doing without having to worry about, okay, now the order book has changed so much and now I don't understand what's going on. So we're going to use this guy, USDC. At least it's good for something. Now for my algorithms, it's important to turn on this thing, algorithm profiling, because we're going to be using that a lot. Here I'm just going to add USDC, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here, look at these parameters, and I'm going to use this little application, and I'm going to make a screenshot every time I change something so that we see exactly what the settings are and what it looks like. Well, here, this will be here all the time. So let's run it and see what happens. We've got an order. Perfect. Now let's figure out why exactly this order is right here. So what are the settings? The default for quoted asset volume was 500K. Well, let's see if we are anywhere near. And apparently not. We are more at 2 million. Why is that? Why is that? Let me show you why. Because here we are at the distance of 1%. And it says it right here, minimum distance 1%. It doesn't matter where, in this case, the 500K volume is. It's somewhere buried over here in this very dense order book. The order never goes below 1% distance from the price. All right. Now let's try and take it to the other limit. We have 5% here. So what would be the case where it stays at 5%? We are somewhere here, and the order book volume at this point is 2.76 million. So I would guess if I were to put around 3 million as the quoted asset volume, then the order would be appearing here at around 5% distance from the price. So let's verify that if I understood that correctly. And that's where it is. It's exactly at 5%. And it's not 3 million as it says here, but it's more like 2.7. But there you go. The minimum distance and the maximum distance are the actual limit of where the order could in fact go. It could never go beyond 5%, and it could never go below 1% with respect to the price. So it has its limits. So if we were to draw this out on the graph, I'll just use whatever tool I have here. So from 1% down to, say, 5%. So this would be the range where the order can move. If we have 1 to 5 here, regardless of what we put anywhere else, it's gonna be between these. But yeah, there is one exception to that, and it's this tick box. Stop if out of range. So if the quoted asset volume that we're looking for is not within this range anywhere in the order book, then the order would not be placed at all. It's gonna sit around and wait until such time where the volume that we're looking for is within the range. So let's just try it out. Yeah, we can just turn on this option, and since 3 million is way beyond 5%, we expect the order to not be placed at all. And there you go. You can see an error message here that says order book out of range, which is expected behavior, which is what we want. We want to learn to control this thing. All right, let's go back and untick this because it's going to mess with our experiments a lot if we have this on. All right, this is what I think is all we can say really about this 1% and 5% minimum and maximum distance and about the quoted volume. Note that these parameters here, 1 and 5, or whatever you want to put here, are the only parameters that have anything to do with the price. Anything else is not related to the price of the coin at all, whatsoever. So if in regular shots you were used to looking at the price and seeing all the things in relation to the price, here forget about it completely. The only thing that has to do with the price is the minimum distance that the order can be placed at and the maximum distance. That's it. Now let's go to this very elusive thing called the buffer. It's a two-component buffer And I got very confused by it in the previous video, or well, the last one where I was talking about depth shots. Let's see, let's first figure out with the default settings, what kind of buffer lines are we seeing. So the default volume buffer is 200K, and the minimum buffer is 0.2%, and the maximum buffer is 0.8%. Let's see what we have got right here. Now, as I mentioned, these are not related to the price at all. These buffers are related to the order itself. So this volume is in relation to the volume in the order book where the order is currently planted. And these percentages are also in relation to the order, not the price. I mean, I'm talking about it so much and so often because that confused me quite a bit in the beginning. So I want to make sure everyone understands. If you don't, if you do, kudos to you. All right, so let's look at this helpful piece of information here, which is algorithm profiling. We've got our quoted asset volume of 500K, we got our buffer of 200K, and here we've got the current distance, which is 1%. As we've mentioned before, this is because it's the minimum setting here. It doesn't matter at this point. And now let's look at the buffer. Where in the world is it? So there's a buffer above the order, and then there's a buffer below the order. Or you can look at it this way. This buffer is closest to the price, and this buffer is furthest away from the price. The price is somewhere here. Yeah. If we were to mirror the order and do it on the sell side, we're going to have the same thing. There's going to be a buffer closest to the price, and there's going to be a buffer furthest away from the price. And the order is somewhere in the middle. So again, let's figure out. So this layout to me is a little bit confusing because here we've got one buffer, then the order, and then another buffer. And here we've got the order, then we've got the buffer in orange that's down here, and then we've got the buffer in purple that's up here. Like, why? Why is it laid out in this way? I don't know. Let's just work with what we have. So this one in orange is now at 1.3% distance, which means it's 0.3 from the order itself. Where does this come from? Well, we have our minimum buffer of 0.2 and maximum buffer of 0.8. And this value is neither of those. So maybe it has something to do with the volume buffer, which is 200K. Half of it goes to this buffer and half of it goes to that buffer. So let's see if we've got 100K difference between here and here. Here we have 2 million, and here we have, well, 2.2. Yeah, 2.1, because there's a big wall here, and 2.1 is somewhere around here. So now we know that this buffer line is most likely coming from the volume buffer. What about this one? It's exactly at 0.2% from here. And the difference in the volume of the order book here is, well, 2, and here it's 187. So the difference is 120 or 130, thereabouts. And actually, if this buffer was looking at the volume, it should have been somewhere around 1.9, which is somewhere around here, but it's at 0.17 distance. So the minimum buffer is at 0.2, so that's where it is. So we've got this buffer that's looking at the actual volume, And we've got this buffer that tried to look at volume, didn't find it anywhere where it's allowed to find it, and it set the buffer line at 0.2 right here. It's gonna become more clear in just a bit if it's still not clear. So let me tell you one thing that got me very, very confused in the beginning. And maybe you are confused too, so let me show you something. Here you see minimum and maximum buffer expressed in percentages, okay. And then here you've got buffer minimum and buffer maximum, also expressed in percentages. Naturally, looking at these, you might think that there is some sort of correlation, yeah? You've got this minimum here of 0.2, and you've got some sort of minimum right here. You've got a maximum of 0.8, and you've got a maximum of actually 0.8 as well. That gets it more confusing. But after about 40 minutes of trying to figure out the correlation between these two, I've concluded that there is none. Despite the fact that these are named very, very similarly to each other, pretty much exactly, only the words switched around, but they have no relation to each other whatsoever. Actually, I'm quite confused as to why these were named this way, even though they have no relation. And also the sequence of these is very confusing to me. So I would call this one, the purple one, like the closest buffer in relation to the price, the closest buffer, and then this one I would call the furthest buffer. These are a bit weird sounding names, but they explain much better the function and the location of these. All right, enough of complaining, let's work with what we have. Now let's try and change something. As I mentioned before, this one is looking at the volume and this one is looking at the minimum buffer setting. Let's try and make both of these act in a similar way. So if I were to change the minimum percentage buffer here to 0.3, let's predict what's going to happen. So if I were at 0.3 away from the order, I would have 1.81 million compared to about 2 here. So I would say that with the volume buffer being 100,000, the buffer line should be somewhere around here, but since we're increasing the minimum in terms of percentages, then this one will be at 0.3 right here. And what about this one? It's now at 0.37. Yeah, and if we were to change the minimum to 0.3, nothing will change. Let's try 0.3 and verify that this is going to move up a little bit, and this one's going to stay the same. All right, so this one is still at 0.36 or 37 away from the order, and this one is at 0.3 from the order. Okay. Let's increase this again to 0.4. Now we have this one at 0.4 and this one is also at 0.4. Now it's looking only at the minimum setting, not at the volume buffer. So the volume buffer would have been plus 100K, and it's sitting somewhere inside this wall, but this wall is closer than 0.4. Now we have both of them going based off of the minimum buffer setting, but the setting is referring to both buffers, the upper one and the lower one. So essentially, if we were to translate this into simple English, this setting right here, the minimum buffer, says that the buffer line cannot be closer to the order than this. All right? the buffer cannot get closer to the order than this. So essentially, if we were to get this very small, then the buffer would be very sensitive. And if it gets bigger, then it becomes less sensitive. On this coin, whether it's sensitive or not doesn't make that much of a difference. But yeah, that's the point of it. Let's try and see how the maximum buffer setting works. It's now at 0.8. Let's make it a bit smaller and see what happens. First, we'll make this one smaller as well, just for the fun of it. And this one we'll make, I don't know, 0.3. Let's see what happens. I'm not sure, I haven't predicted everything yet. So let's take a picture of this and let's go. Let's figure out what happens here. All right. This is at 0.19 from the order, and this one, well, at 0.3. Why is that? They are different, obviously, so they're looking at different things. Now, let's zoom in a little bit and try and check this out. So we are here again at about 2 million because that's the minimum distance. And the volume buffer, we need to add 100,000. So that will be, here we have 197, so about 2.1. 2.1 is way down here. So this must be 0.3, our maximum buffer. Yeah, you see, we're having this buffer at the maximum setting, even though the actual volume buffer, the calculated value of the volume buffer is somewhere around here. So this is not allowing the buffer line to go beyond a certain point, regardless of the situation in the order book. So this kind of puts a cap on how insensitive the buffer could actually be. Now this one, here we are at 197, here I would expect to see 187. And yeah, 187 is somewhere in this little wall. Okay, so now we have found out that this setting says the buffer could not be further away from the order than this, right? The minimum one says it cannot be closer to the order than 0.1, and this one says it cannot be further away from the order than 0.3. This is the limit of how sensitive it is, and this is a limit to how insensitive it is. And that's about it for the minimum and maximum buffer settings. So if we were to do the same thing we did before for the maximum and minimum distance, let's take some drawing tool and we go, so we have 0.1 to 0.3, 0.1 is here, and 0.3 is here. So, and let's do it for this side as well. So this means that the buffer line, regardless of what happens in the order book itself, regardless of what the volume buffer might be, the buffer lines should stay within this range, the top buffer, and within this range, the bottom buffer. There's no way around it. So overall, our minimum and maximum distance are 1 to 5 from the price. So we go here and we go, yeah, okay, like this. So the allowable range for the order itself is from 1 to 5, somewhere here with these settings. And then the allowable range for buffer lines, for each individual buffer line, is between here, and then here and here. This is like the way I visually see it. There's this allowable zone, and then these are two allowable zones. There's nothing more to it. This is some sort of hierarchy. So first of all, what matters is the minimum and maximum distance. If that is valid, then we go to the buffer, and then we have the limits from minimum percentage to maximum percentage from the order line. And then if the volume buffer itself falls within this range and this range, then it's a go. Then the buffer is looking at the volume. Otherwise, if the volume is somewhere outside, then the buffer goes to the closest limit chosen from either here or here. I hope that was clear. Maybe we'll do more examples. Let's see where we go from here. All right, so far this has been very, very static. Absolutely nothing going on. The order stays in the same place. The buffer stays in the same place. Let's make it a little bit more interesting. It's always currently staying at the minimum of 1%. Let's make it a bit more real. So here we've got at 1% a volume of about 2 million. Let's set the quoted asset volume to 2 million and see what changes. All right, now our order is at the distance of 1.33. And let's look at the buffer lines. What's happening here? You see, these are sort of disproportionate. This one is much further away, and this one is much closer to the order. So let's see why that is. Half of our volume buffer is still 100K. So based off of here, we go down. It's 2 million here, and we should be looking for 2.1. Well, it's somewhere around here. But we've got the minimum setting of 0.1 right here, and that's where it is. Whoa, look, the order book is changing pretty rapidly. I need to see what happened at this point. I didn't catch. So apparently at some point this went from looking at the minimum possible, which is 0.1, and then the order book shifted in a way where the actual volume shifted to here. This one is at the distance of 0.3 from the order, which looks sort of like the maximum here. Here we are at 199, so minus 100K is 189. And 189 is somewhere over there. 189 is here, so this is definitely at the maximum percentage buffer level. So yeah, here we have the case where this one is at the minimum buffer percentage level and this one is at the maximum. And both of them at this point in time are completely ignoring the volume buffer because it's outside. Here it's further away than the maximum allowable buffer line, and here it is closer to the order than the minimum buffer line allows it to be. So how do we change the settings in a way where these could be looking at the volume buffer itself? So in this case, we're looking for, what are we looking for? 189, for example, yeah? 189 is at 0.43%. So we should increase the maximum buffer here to at least 0.5 or 0.6. And with this one, we're looking at about 2.1, somewhere here. Well, it's in this huge wall, or even a bit closer to it, so it's barely visible. Yeah, it's in this wall at minus 0.03. So we have to make this one very small and this one quite a bit larger. So let's try that. Okay, we see that the position of this one is changed. It's now at 0.33 and it corresponds with 100K here. Here we're looking at 1.89 and here we've got 1.99. Okay, now this is looking at the volume buffer. It is within these limits for the buffer line. Now for the lower one right here, it's very close to the order. Somewhere at around 0.02. It's not super close, and within this wall, we've got our 2.1 that we're looking for based on that buffer. Let's now change the buffer. Let's go, how high do we have to go? So let's say 2 plus, yeah, let's put 300K there. So we're going to be looking at 2.15. No, it's still too low. Let's put 400K there and see what happens. So now we can see that this one is based off of the volume buffer. Half of it is 200K. Here we are at 2, and here we are at 2.2. Excellent. And for this one, it's at about 1.8. Yeah, it's about 1.8. Yeah, so you can see that the order book is kind of asymmetrical. And that's why the buffer looks like this. And I'm going to show you a few tricks that I've picked up while trying different things here. So, first of all, what if we take this and sort of reverse them? Let's put something big around here, like 0.7, and something small around here, like 0.3. What would that do? The minimum is bigger than the maximum. So let's see what happens. Okay, here we are. This is our order, and this is at 0.3, and this is at 0.3. Interesting. So they are looking at this one, at the maximum buffer, which says that the order cannot be further away from, the buffer cannot be further away from the order than 0.3, and that's where it looks. It doesn't care about 0.7, and actually it does not even care about the volume buffer. So currently it's at 200K, so we should be really looking at the order book to see where plus or minus 100K is. We are at, let's say, 198. So we're looking at 188. 188 is somewhere around here, but the line is way above that. And down here, we're looking for 2.1 or thereabouts. 2.1 is here, so it is outside. It's further away from the order than the buffer line. And this one is closer to the order than the buffer line, but the buffer lines do not care about this at all. They just stay at 0.3. No matter actually what I do with the volume buffer in this case, they're always going to stay at 0.3. Let's make a very crazy buffer. Let's make it, I don't know, let's make it 3 million. And it absolutely doesn't care. the buffer lines are right here. So this is sort of a workaround if you want your old, good, and familiar buffer that only looks at the percentage. So basically, this is ignored, and you have the buffer of 0.3 on both sides. The only difference is that it's not relative to the price, it's relative to the order. Yeah, here is an interesting point I want to make. You see that the order stays here, and then there is some middle line right here which diverges from the order itself. It goes up and goes down. So this is what we see here, what's called distance. This shows not the distance of the order, it shows the distance of this midline. And it's constantly changing, but since the outer buffer lines are not touching the order itself yet, the order is very static. It just stays there. And now it has moved. So yeah, that's an important difference, important nuance, if you like. The distance here is not actually the distance of the order. It's the distance of this midline that tries to follow the quoted volume, the quoted asset volume as much as possible. Sometimes it's on the same level as the order and sometimes it's not. But I mean, I guess I've shown you what I wanted to show you. I've explained everything I've understood so far about this. Now it's all about finding ways to apply it to real life instead of this sandbox, the boring one, which is USDC. So in summary, the depth shots algo has a hierarchy of different limits, within which the remaining parameters further down the line are operating with limited degrees of freedom. The first major limit, and actually the only one that has anything to do with the price of the coin, is the minimum and maximum distance. These are like swim lines outside of which the order would not go under any circumstances. All the remaining parameters have nothing to do with the price, and they have everything to do with the order book. The quoted asset volume is simply the expected instantaneous trading volume we predict to happen in the corresponding part of the order book, which then would make a shot. Next, the buffer. The two-component buffer is always in relation to the current position of the order. As I've mentioned, to be completely accurate, the buffer is in the relation to this distance parameter, which is the midline shown in the algo profiling, and which is always as close as possible to the quoted asset volume setting, but taking into account the limitations imposed by the minimum and maximum distance. That was a mouthful. Of the available buffer parameters, I consider the minimum and maximum percentage buffer to be the primary limitation imposed on the buffer. Much like minimum and maximum distance for the order, these percentages specify the swim lines within which the buffer could move freely, but never outside. And it must take into account the remaining parameter further down the line of hierarchy, which is the volume buffer. So to me, the minimum buffer says that the buffer line cannot, under any circumstances, be closer to the order than this. And the maximum buffer says the buffer line cannot be farther away from the order than this. And as for the volume buffer, again, it is always in the relation to the order, and it is split into two. Half is above the order and half is below the order. It allows the order to not move unless the order book volume at the current order location changes by more than half of the volume buffer. So if one half of the volume buffer is located within the range between the minimum and maximum percentage buffer limits, then the volume buffer value takes priority, and that's where the buffer stays. On the other hand, if one half of the volume buffer is outside these limits, then the buffer line will be placed at the nearest percentage limit line. The buffer above the order and the buffer below the order live their own separate lives, despite the fact that they have the very same rules apply to both of them. Depending on the state of the order book, both can be at percentage limit lines or both could be at volume buffer lines, or any combination thereof. Plus, it may change over time during the life of the order. Again, I want to remind you that this minimum and maximum buffer has absolutely no relation to these buffer minimum and buffer maximum lines, and in my opinion, these are very confusingly named. Now that I know exactly how this works and how to control it on the most boring coin in the world, the next step would be to use this knowledge on a more exciting coin and actually apply these mechanics to real-world trading. But this video has been long enough already. I will address the application in one of the upcoming videos. I hope that would be a little bit more exciting than this. I hope this was useful and my efforts paid off to at least one more person other than myself. Thank you for spending your time with me and listening to what I have to say. Have a very nice day, and I will see you soon.